The abandoned house on Imperial Avenue in East Cleveland, Ohio, holds a dark history as the location where Anthony Sowell, also known as the Cleveland Strangler, committed his horrific crimes. From 2007 to 2009, Sowell, a convicted sex offender, lured his victims to his home, where he ultimately ended their lives. When police entered the property in 2009, they found the remains of 11 women hidden within the house and yard, uncovering a nightmare concealed behind the house's unassuming exterior. This chilling case left a lasting scar on the community, with the house standing as a grim reminder of the victims and the fear that gripped Cleveland during that time. As the cold autumn night settled over East Cleveland, a pale moon cast shadows over the crumbling house on Imperial Avenue. Most people avoided it, a relic of decay with boarded-up windows and a collapsed porch, left forgotten in the passage of time. But tonight, something felt different. The house seemed to breathe, its walls shifting like they held secrets that refused to stay buried. Teenagers dared each other to go inside, lured by whispers and rumors. They said that, on certain nights, you could hear faint cries coming from the basement or smell something foul even after all these years. People swore that shadows moved across the shattered windows, though no one had lived there since the horror was uncovered. Elena had always dismissed the stories as nothing more than urban legends. But curiosity pulled her back to the house on this particular night, a challenge she accepted without fully understanding why. She brought a flashlight, its narrow beam slicing through the dense dark that clung to the walls. The air inside was cold and damp, and each step on the creaky floor seemed to echo louder than the last. As she moved through the first room, her flashlight danced over faded, peeling wallpaper, the colors muted by years of neglect. She tried to push away the thought of what had happened here, focusing instead on the odd markings scratched into the wall, scratches that looked too deliberate, too fresh. Then she saw it. An old photograph, lying on the ground, edges curling with age. In the dim light, she could barely make out the figures, a young woman with a haunting smile, her eyes wide and dark. Elena shuddered, realizing she had seen that face in newspaper clippings, stories, and old photographs about the victims. But this photo, it looked too new, like it hadn't been here all those years. Elena's fingers trembled as she picked up the photograph, her breath catching in her throat. There was something almost alive in the woman's gaze, as though her eyes held a warning, one that Elena was only beginning to understand. Suddenly, a noise echoed from deeper within the house, a soft but unmistakable scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. Heart pounding, Elena turned toward the sound, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The beam caught the edge of a narrow hallway leading toward the back of the house, where the shadows seemed denser, thicker. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave and forget she'd ever set foot inside. But something drew her forward, an inexplicable pull that overpowered her fear. As she moved down the hallway, she could feel the air growing colder, more oppressive, as if the house itself were alive, exhaling its darkness onto her skin. Her footfalls seemed muted, swallowed by the silence that pressed in around her. At the end of the hall, a door hung slightly ajar, its paint peeling in long, ragged strips. The basement. She paused, heart racing, feeling an almost magnetic pull urging her to descend. She couldn't explain why she needed to go down there, but it felt as if an unseen hand were guiding her. Swallowing her fear, she took a step forward, her flashlight illuminating the steep stairs that led into the basement's depths. The air was thick with damp and decay, carrying an almost metallic scent that clung to her lungs. The moment she set foot on the stairs, the door behind her creaked shut, sealing her in darkness. Panic surged, and she stumbled, barely catching herself on the railing. When she steadied herself, her flashlight flickered, casting frantic beams across the narrow stairwell. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint and close. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The whisper was soft, almost tender, like someone speaking just behind her ear. Words she couldn't quite make out, but the tone, it was pleading, desperate. Elena froze, her eyes wide, staring into the darkness below. The basement seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness swallowing her flashlight's weak beam. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper itself. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. But then she heard a reply, more a sigh than a voice, drifting up from the blackness below. Elena. Her name. She was certain of it this time, each syllable drawn out like a warning. Her grip tightened on the flashlight as she took a hesitant step down, her pulse quickening. As she descended, the walls around her seemed to close in, the damp air wrapping her like a shroud. Halfway down, she saw something glinting on one of the steps. It was an old locket, its delicate chain broken, the tarnished silver barely catching her light. She knelt to pick it up, recognizing the face inside the same young woman from the photograph. A chill traced down her spine, but she held onto the locket as if it could anchor her. The basement was colder than she'd imagined, and as she stepped off the final stair, a heavy silence pressed against her, swallowing even the sound of her own breathing. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing an abandoned mattress, crumpled blankets, scattered belongings, and scratch marks along the walls. In the corner, there was a shape, something hunched, wrapped in shadow. She forced her light over it, and her heart skipped as the form shifted, slowly unfurling, like it had been waiting. Elena. This time, the whisper came from all around her, echoing off the walls. Her fingers gripped the flashlight until her knuckles turned white, but the light began to dim, fading as if the darkness itself was pulling the life from it. And then, in the fading glow, she saw them, the faces. Pale and faint, hovering just beyond reach, their eyes wide with sorrow, with longing, as if pleading for release. Her heart raced, and just as she stumbled back, the air grew thick with whispers, overlapping voices, each one more urgent than the last. The whispers surrounded her, a symphony of voices echoing from every corner of the basement, filling her head until she could barely think. Faces emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, each one contorted in pain, their eyes fixed on her with a desperation that seemed to pierce her very soul. Elena. Please, the voices layered over each other, weaving a dense tapestry of sorrow and pleading. Her back hit the cold, damp wall, and she realized there was no escape. The stairs had somehow receded into the dark, leaving her trapped. One face, clearer than the others, stepped forward. She recognized her from the photo, the locket, the woman with haunting eyes. Her mouth moved, but her words were drowned in the other's cries. Desperation clung to her expression as she reached out a translucent hand, beckoning Elena closer. Elena hesitated, the weight of every instinct screaming at her to stay back. But the woman's eyes, they were full of something beyond terror, something raw and pleading. Against her better judgment, she took a step forward, her hand reaching out. Elena, the woman's voice broke through, clear and crisp. You have to see. You have to understand. Before Elena could react, an icy chill wrapped around her hand, the spirit's touch searing her skin with cold. In a flash, her vision went dark, replaced by another, an image vivid and real. She was no longer in the basement but back in the house, in this very room, but it was brighter, and she could hear laughter echoing from upstairs, familiar voices calling down the hall. She was seeing through someone else's eyes. The house was alive, vibrant, far from the rotting structure she'd just walked through. She looked around, confused, as she felt herself moving down the hall. The laughter turned into music, a soft tune crackling from an old radio. A door opened before her, and she found herself looking into the faces of two young women, talking and laughing as they cleaned up in the kitchen. But then, something shifted. The music distorted, fading into a hollow hum, and the women's laughter turned to silence. A shadow passed over them, a figure in the doorway, blocking out the light. Elena felt a shiver course through her borrowed body, fear filling her borrowed heart. The shadow moved closer, and she could feel her own heartbeat mingling with the terror that pulsed in her chest. The vision fractured, and she was thrown back into the basement, gasping for air. The spirits crowded around her, their faces inches from hers, their eyes hollow, pleading. She stumbled back, struggling to breathe, her voice caught in her throat as the figures pressed in, each one whispering a single word over and over. Remember. The weight of the spirit's presence was suffocating, pressing against her until every breath felt like dragging in thick smoke. The whispers grew louder, each word merging into the next, forming a haunting chant that filled her mind. Remember, remember, their plea wrapped around her. And as the basement's shadows deepened, she felt the chill in her bones, an unnatural cold, something ancient and hungry. Her flashlight flickered, casting weak beams across the damp walls. In one brief flash, she saw something scratched into the far wall. Jagged letters etched in a trembling hand, the words barely visible through the grime and decay. She moved closer, her fingers brushing over the indentations as she read the faded message aloud. Her voice a shaky whisper. "Find him." The room seemed to tighten around her, the faces pressing in closer, as if those two words held some long-buried answer they were desperate for her to uncover. But find who? Her mind spun as she struggled to piece together the meaning, the frantic whispers swelling around her as if impatient for her to understand. Just then, the basement door above her burst open with a loud, jarring creak, sending a thin shaft of pale moonlight slicing through the dark. She whipped her head around, heart pounding, but saw no one, just the shifting shadows. Yet she could feel a presence at the top of the stairs, a sensation prickling down her spine. Gathering her courage, she took a step toward the stairs, the cold air biting at her skin. Behind her, the spirit's voices softened, fading back into hushed murmurs, as if waiting to see what she would do. The silence was tense, almost expectant, and as she placed her foot on the first step, something caught her eye. A small, tarnished ring lay glinting at the edge of the stair, its surface dulled but unmistakably carved with initials AS. Her heart clenched. Anthony Sowell, the name itself seemed to awaken a deeper horror within her. Memories of news reports, the chilling stories of what he'd done, of the women he'd claimed. But this wasn't just a reminder of the past, it was as though the ring held a purpose, something binding it to the present. As she reached down, her fingers closed around it, and in an instant, a surge of images flooded her mind. Fleeting moments, faces, memories of lives lost, each one flashing faster than the last, too quick for her to fully grasp. And then, she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the stairs behind her. She whipped around, clutching the ring tight in her hand, as a shadow appeared at the top of the stairs, blocking out the light, growing larger with each step. The shadow loomed, its form stretching along the stairwell as it descended, each step slow and deliberate. Elena's heart hammered in her chest, her grip tightening around the tarnished ring, its cold metal biting into her palm. The darkness thickened, swallowing the last traces of light as the figure drew nearer. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt as if they were rooted to the floor, paralyzed by a terror that clung to her like ice. The shadow finally stopped just a few steps above her, lingering in silence. Elena squinted, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, trying to make out any detail in the figure's shape. But it was amorphous, shifting, an outline that seemed more shadow than substance. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a breath, it spoke. Elena. Her name fell from its lips with an eerie familiarity, the sound cold and hollow. She could feel it pressing into her mind, a voice that felt as though it didn't belong to the living. She clutched the ring tighter, her thumb brushing over the etched initials. Yes, was it him? Was she standing before the specter of the very man whose atrocities had cursed this place? The figure took another step forward, and for a fleeting moment, Elena thought she saw something within the shadows, a glint of eyes, empty and yet seething with something dark. The other spirits, once pressing close, now seemed to retreat, as if held at bay by this presence. Elena, it whispered again, a thread of malice lacing the tone. You shouldn't have come here. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Why are you here? Haven't you done enough? A low, chilling laugh echoed through the basement, seeping into the walls. They're not the only ones tied to this place. The shadow's form wavered, shifting, as though it were both here and somewhere else. They hold me here, yes, but not as you think. They keep me bound, a prisoner just as they are. The bitterness in the words twisted, darkening the air around him. Elena's mind raced. The spirits, they weren't just here to haunt this place, they were keeping him trapped, tethered to the site of his crimes. It was a punishment, a revenge, an eternal prison. She could feel their presence swirling around her, their whispers mingling with her own desperate thoughts. But then, as if sensing her realization, the shadow's tone shifted, softening to an almost pleading murmur. "Release me, Elena. You hold the key." It gestured toward her clenched hand, toward the ring she gripped so tightly. Elena's pulse quickened, her gaze dropping to the ring in her hand. The tarnished metal seemed to radiate a strange warmth, pulsing in time with her heartbeat, as if it held a life of its own. She knew she should throw it away, cast it aside and run, but the pleading in the shadow's voice held her in place, a strange curiosity mingling with her fear. "Release you?" she whispered, a tremor threading through her words. "After everything you did?" The shadow flickered, its form stretching and twisting, a haunting silence answering her question. For a moment, she could almost see his face, hollow eyes staring back at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. But there was something else there, something layered beneath the malice, a desperation, a kind of agony woven into his very being. "They keep me here," the shadow murmured, its voice low and strained. "Each of them, bound to their suffering because of me. And now you," the figure stretched out a hand, fingers elongated, almost skeletal, reaching toward her. She took a shaky step back, her spine pressing against the cold basement wall. "You can free them, Elena," the voice continued, softer now, almost coaxing. "You can end their suffering. And mine." The spirits around her seemed to stir, their whispers rising in a chorus of tension, pleading and warning all at once. The basement walls felt closer, the air tighter, and Elena could sense their anguish, their fear of what she might do. They had spent years bound to this place, guarding it, containing him. Yet could she really free them? Could she put an end to their pain, break the chains that tied them to the scene of their last breaths? But what would that mean for him? The shadow seemed to sense her hesitation. "They'll be free, gone from this place. Isn't that what you want?" Its voice was insidious, softening, slipping into her thoughts like poison. "All you have to do is give it to me." Her fingers closed tighter around the ring, the initials almost burning into her palm. She could feel the spirit's energy swirling around her, growing desperate, almost frantic. A sense of urgency seeped into her bones, as if they were trying to tell her something, to communicate beyond words. Taking a steadying breath, she forced herself to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. "If I release them, what happens to you?" The shadow's face seemed to twist, a smile flickering over its hollow features, something ancient and hungry glinting in its eyes. "Then I'm free too, Elena. Free to leave this prison and find new places to roam." A chill washed over her, and she realized the awful truth. He wasn't asking to be freed for their sake, but for his own. And if she released them all, he would be free to continue the horrors he'd begun in this house, free to haunt and harm beyond these walls. The spirits surged around her, their forms flickering as if urging her to resist, to hold strong against the shadow's lure. Elena's fingers tightened around the ring, feeling its weight and the echoes of all it represented. She looked at the shadow before her, its hollow eyes filled with a sinister anticipation, and then at the spirits hovering around her, their faces etched with sorrow and silent pleading. A shiver ran through her, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a sudden, fierce determination. She understood now. The spirits weren't haunting this place, they were protecting it. They'd bound themselves here, tethered to this wretched house to ensure that he could never leave, that he could never harm anyone else. Taking a deep breath, Elena looked into the shadow's eyes and spoke with a newfound strength. "You don't deserve freedom, not after what you did. They're not the ones who need release from suffering, you are." The shadow recoiled, its form flickering violently, twisting as if in pain. "You don't understand," it hissed, its voice a guttural growl. "You have the power. You hold the key. You must release me." But Elena stood firm, her grip on the ring so tight she thought it might shatter in her hand. She felt the spirits around her rallying, their energy surging as if bolstered by her decision. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. Lifting the ring, she held it out before her, the tarnished metal catching a flicker of light from her flashlight. She whispered, her voice steady, "This is all that's left of you. It's all you deserve." And with that, she threw the ring down onto the cold concrete floor and brought her heel down, grinding it into the ground with all her strength. The metal cracked with a high-pitched snap, splintering into tiny fragments. The reaction was immediate. The shadow let out a howl, an inhuman wail that echoed through the basement, vibrating the very walls. It thrashed, twisting and writhing as if it were being torn apart, its form splintering and scattering like wisps of smoke. The faces of the spirits glowed with a strange light, their sorrow fading as they watched the shadow disintegrate, breaking apart until nothing remained. The basement fell silent, the air suddenly still and light. Elena could feel the presence of the spirits around her, a soft, gentle warmth in place of their former anguish. One by one, their faces turned to her, their eyes now filled with a quiet gratitude. And then, as if lifted by an invisible wind, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air, their final whispers brushing past her like a soft breeze. "Thank you." When the last spirit had gone, Elena stood alone in the quiet basement, the shadows lighter, the air somehow warmer. The oppressive chill was gone, the darkness now just a simple darkness, empty and ordinary. She felt an immense peace settle over her, a sense that the house had finally been freed from its curse. As she made her way back up the stairs, she took one last look at the basement, now just an old empty space. With a steadying breath, she walked out into the night, leaving the house and its horrors behind her, forever. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.